Welcome to the Bad Movie Beatdown review of 2015. I'll be looking at the movers and shakers of the film world last year, as well as my picks for the best and worst films. But if you've never seen one of these episodes before, I'll give you a quick recap. This time I've seen over 100 films from 2015, including theatrical, direct-to-video or on-demand releases. As usual, this video is coming out so late because I've spent much of January catching up on some of those I might have missed, as well as discovering that the 99p rentals on Amazon are a gateway into borderline unwatchable tripe. Usually the other reason it's delayed is so I can catch up on some awards contenders, but thanks to the release of Star Wars, many of those films like Spotlight or Trumbo won't come out in the UK until after this video comes out or just before it. The rule is that had to have been playing to a paying audience in 2015, so films that appeared at festivals in 2014 but weren't publicly released until the subsequent year count, but belated 2014 entries that opened late in the UK like John Wick do not. So even some films are reviewed on Projector that opened in the US and UK in 2015 like Trash or Search Party for example don't count because they were released in other countries the previous year. I like to stress these lists are not set in stone and are purely at the time of this video, so there are some good films that manage to slip through the cracks like Sicario, and I managed to avoid some really awful ones like Jupiter Ascending or The Gallows. So what was the big thing last year? Nostalgia. If nothing else, 2015 proved the kids who used to play with Star Wars and Jurassic Park toys have now become the people in charge. Needless to say, the year was dominated by two films, a new Jurassic Park flick and a new Star Wars film, and the difference between the two shows the approaches this can take. Star Wars The Force Awakens did all it could to please fans of the original films and repair the damage to the series' reputation that was caused by the prequels made by people who loved those movies, basically taking fans back to when they were 5 and probably first saw the original, which is why it works so well. On the other hand, Jurassic World is a movie that's deeply cynical about everything up to and including its own existence. Loaded with ironic product placement, World places itself as a bungled satire on cash grab sequels and how audiences grow fickle and jaded. Nobody's impressed by a dinosaur anymore is a line that says much about how Jurassic World attempts to trample on the sense of wonder that Steven Spielberg's film sets up, but it's also blatantly wrong. Up until Star Wars came out, Jurassic World was the highest grossing film of 2015 worldwide, so clearly a lot of people wanted to see dinosaurs. What they weren't impressed with was a story lame with plot holes, a workaholic female character getting punished for not leaping into motherhood, and somehow managing to be just as disappointing as The Lost World all those years ago. Star Wars isn't perfect, but at least it serves up its retro charms without snorting it's too good for it. In an age dominated by franchises and remakes of things for no discernible reason, cough Point Break, it's not surprising that the two biggest films of the year are resurrections of iconic but dormant franchises that are still so enormously popular that they were instant hits regardless of their quality, even if one took that for granted and the other did not. As usual, franchises dominated the year, perhaps even more so than usual. When I was writing this, I was having a hard time remembering big trends or news stories so much as individual films, and looking at the box office seems to back up that conclusion. In not wholly unsurprising news, the yearly box office in 2015 was the highest it has ever been in both the US and the UK, considering that this was a year that had Star Wars, James Bond and many others. If 2014 was considered to be disappointing because of its relative dearth of such films, 2015 more than made up for it. What seems to have been a major change is that studios are gradually coming around to the idea of blockbuster event movies all year round, rather than loading them up for the summer and winter and giving them more room to clear up. The most obvious evidence is that box office records were smashed month after month in the US. The wide release of American Sniper broke the record for January, 50 Shades of Grey did the same thing in February, Furious 7 ruled April, Hotel Transylvania 2 inexplicably became the biggest opening in September ever, and of course Star Wars capped off the year by setting the record for December and all time. Age of Ultron just barely missing doing the same thing in May? Pfft, lightweight. But even if they weren't breaking records, there was at least one major tentpole film per month, and the fact of the matter is there were less films making big money. Only 95 films made it past $25 million domestically in 2015, and the top 10 biggest earners accounted for 35% of the whole year's grosses, the highest percentage has ever risen to, which is perhaps the most dubious of records to break. If anything, it goes to prove how much lower, even mid-budget films are being crowded out of the marketplace onto video-on-demand obscurity, and that makes distribution very difficult. I've even seen this myself on Projector, where a number of films like Terry Jones's Absolutely Anything, Sweet Fiancée, Search Party, and The Dressmaker have all failed to receive US releases despite their well-known casts. It's certainly not a situation that's going to improve anytime soon, given how much life from 2016 onward is comic book movie central, but generally the story has been that of the big brands. Universal has ruled overall thanks to 50 Shades, Jurassic World, Minions, and Straight Outta Compton, while Pixar managed to get its mojo back with Inside Out, and then lost it again with The Good Dinosaur. In short, we live in an event cinema world where being the 7th film in a series is nothing to be ashamed of anymore. If nothing else, the awards season reminds us that there are films that don't revolve around saving the world, and it's often joked the awards season highlight films that people don't actually see, but that was literally the case in 2015. Looking back at 2015's Oscar race, it was probably one of the tightest I can think of, and that was in part due to the fact that many of those films weren't huge runaway successes, to the point where the Academy was accused of, gasp, shunning popular movies, as if that's the worst thing they could be possibly accused of, given American Sniper grossed more than the other Best Picture nominees combined. A more substantial allegation was the fact there was no black actors in any of the acting categories for the first time since 1998, and were especially irritated by the fact that David Oyelowo was snubbed for his performance as Martin Luther King in Selma, resulting in the Twitter hashtag #OscarsSoWhite, and reminding us that the Academy is largely made up of old white dudes. As I write this episode, the nominations have been announced for the 2016 awards, and the Academy have shown they've learned absolutely nothing from that, because for the second year running, the acting categories are as white as a supernova, perhaps being even more egregious because Creed was largely ignored by Sylvester Stallone, as was Straight Outta Compton except for Best Original Screenplay, which meant that only white people were nominated for films with black directors and largely black casts, and proving that old white dudes are incredibly stubborn. Still, it should provide host Chris Rock with some fantastic material. Going back to the previous year's awards, it was a largely well-balanced ceremony where the awards went in the right directions. The Grand Budapest Hotel stormed the technical categories, J.K. Simmons and Julianne Moore picked up the wins everyone predicted, and Eddie Redmayne's performance of Stephen Hawking trumped Michael Keaton, which will be trying to replicate this year with transgender drama The Danish Girl, and if he wins, hopefully he'll give an unbelievably British and awkward speech again.
This Oscar...
Eddie, can you stop reminding me of myself in everyday situations? It's starting to creep me out. The biggest controversy for many was that Richard Linklater's 12 years in the making Boyhood largely lost out to Birdman, including Best Picture, although that was somewhat mitigated by film fans laying a collective sigh of relief that American Sniper didn't win. In retrospect, it's not surprising that Birdman won, given how it's a film about how actors are special snowflakes and is all about the business, even if it doesn't appear on the surface to be conventional Oscar fare, and certainly the only Best Picture winner to have a scene where Michael Keaton is terrorised by Edward Norton's erection. I didn't see the ceremony, but I did see morning TV reporters camped outside the Vanity Fair after party shoving microphones into people's faces, although for my money the biggest snub of the night was when BBC's Alistair Leafhead tried and failed to get host Neil Patrick Harris's attention.
Oh, Neil Patrick Harris is coming. Maybe he'll come and talk to us. Neil Patrick Harris, we're live on BBC News. Can you come and have a chat? Quick chat, we're live on air now, no? Oh, he's busy. He's had a really busy night.
One thing that was notable about the 2015 Oscars was that it was more politically charged than usual, with the likes of Selma and The Imitation Game garnering much attention for their real-life stories, but also the speeches from the winners, which marked the year where we started paying a lot more attention to the matters of diversity and representation. Indeed, the aforementioned hashtag #OscarsSoWhite was only part of the debates that got much more focus this year. Patricia Arquette's speech for her win for Boyhood highlighted the disparity in pay between actresses and their male counterparts, the sort of thing which may force an award-winning but working actress to appear in CSI Cyber. In general, female performers made up to 40% less than their male leads, and thanks to the ongoing ramifications of 2014's Sony hack, one could easily see the disparity in their wages. Indeed, that's exactly exactly what Jennifer Lawrence did when she picked up this issue for herself, knowing that she was paid far less than, quote, lucky people with dicks in American Hustle, and was disappointed in herself for obeying to the pressures of a system that commends men for being fierce and tactical, but if a woman did the same thing, they would be thought of as difficult and spoiled. One of those lucky dicks in American Hustle, and regular Lawrence co-star Bradley Cooper, pledged to share his wages with his female co-stars to help address this, but whether this will lead to broader change, we'll have to see. Women were also fighting for their representation on screen too. Mad Max Fury Road was commended for its strong female characters, particularly Charlize Theron's Furiosa, rebelling against their tyrannical, objectifying ruler and its strong feminist message. Ex Machina in part was about the objectification of the male gaze, and this year finally saw the suffragettes get a movie about them. Not all examples were positive. Age of Ultron was criticised for its treatment of Black Widow and her infertility plotline, specifically a line where she calls herself a monster, and off camera for the fact that the merchandising continues to marginalise the character. Women as baby makers was also a deeply troubling part of Bryce Dallas Howard's arc in Jurassic World, and they were literally being handed out as trophies and pixels. In terms of this sort of thing, we've still got a ways to go, but at least there are a number of films from female directors with largely female casts and leads that got wide distribution in the UK, including The Dressmaker, Suffragette, The Falling, Pitch Perfect 2, Miss You Already, and 50 Shades of Grey. Hey, harumph all you want, it still counts. And when the biggest film of the year casts a woman and a black man from Peckham as its leads, it feels like it could well be a turning point. And Ray even managed to get her toys after they tried to pull a Black Widow on her despite being the main character, so maybe things are looking up. And while we're in a happier mood during the awards season, let's hand out the most meaningless of them all, the Film Brain Awards. So what silliness caught my attention this year? The Film Brain Awards! MVP of the Year! This easily goes to Alicia Vikander, who has had nothing short of an absolutely amazing year. First she played Vera Brittain in the film version of Britten's memoir Testament of Youth, and Vikander did an excellent job of portraying an idealistic young woman who experiences firsthand the horror and grief of the First World War. Just a week later she gave a complex and nuanced turn as the robot in Ex Machina, who is constantly trying to fool the audience's Turing test. Proving she wasn't all seriousness, she got to have a bit of fun in retro clothing and big sunglasses in Guy Ritchie's The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and by this point Vikander got so noticed that a completely pointless part was added for her in Bradley Cooper's cooking drama Burnt. And to close out, she starred in The Danish Girl in a performance that many reviewers felt was even better than Eddie Redmayne's, and was rewarded with an Oscar nomination. By anyone's reckoning, that is one hell of a bloody good year. Most Prominent Film Burial. Despite an all-star cast, Cameron Crowe's Aloha didn't exactly have good buzz around it before it opened stateside. Amy Pascal herself even lamented she'd never start a movie again when the script is ridiculous and we all know it, which sounds like common sense to me. But after it sank both critically and commercially, it seems international distributor 20th Century Fox had severe doubts about its chances of success because in the UK it never even saw a cinema screen. A scheduled release day in September, months after its US run, disappeared in that month, and no one knew what happened to it until it quietly showed up on video-on-demand services with no promotion whatsoever, not even managing to earn a DVD release. Welcome to burying failures in the 21st century. If you really don't want people to be aware of a film, don't even release physical copies of it so you can plausibly deny its existence, much like how Cameron Crowe wants to do with having anything related to Aloha. Biggest behind-the-scenes disaster! Director Josh Trank made quite the calling card on Chronicle, which was pretty much an audition tape for helming a superhero movie, which Fox obliged by allowing them to reboot the Fantastic Four. There were reports that Trank's behaviour on set was unruly, often showing up late and high, and that his dogs even trashed the property he was staying at during the production. Most damningly, there are even reports that substantial portions of the film had to be reshot, which meant that the planned 3D conversion was cancelled, and Kate Mara, who had cut her hair between time, got a wig that was something like out of a joke shop. With the overriding secrecy about the project in general giving way to terrible reviews, I briefly ended up a Twitter sensation after seeing an advanced screening. Trank, instead of keeping silent like most directors usually do in this situation, laid the finishing blow by making a quickly deleted tweet the day before it came out, confirming that the film was taken away and implying that the finished result was a disaster. The final film was an unmitigated catastrophe, and I'm pretty certain that no one will be allowing Trank think in charge of a film production anytime soon. Oh, and what the hell happened to that scene in the trailer where the thing fell out of a jet? Worst special effect! Terminator Genisys was a failed reboot/continuation in much the same way that Salvation was, that most stayed away from, but clearly even the special effects people were not that interested either, judging by the work in this scene. Here's Arnold, or a stunt double, walking through a wall, and it's a common trick to paste on the actor's face, but I've seldom seen it as literal as take a photo of Arnold and keyframe it. A photo, I might add, that's missing the Terminator's facial scars just to add insult to injury. They might as well have put a cardboard cutout on the double's face, Game of Death style, it would be just as convincing. Breakout on-screen star! When one sees Alvin and the Chipmunks The Road Chip, one never imagines that you'll catch a glimpse of a new star, but there he is, right next to Jason Lee's head. It's Channel Awesome contributor That Sci-Fi Guy, who managed to bag himself a very prominent role as an extra, and hilariously, gives a far better performance than Jason Lee at pretending to be into high-pitched singing chipmunks and really being into their jamming tunes. If they do make a fifth film, I'll be the first to say they need to bring him back. Pissing off the most number of people. It seems Adam Sandler's continued state of apathy has made him public enemy number one, especially in the light of Pixels, where gamers and film reviewers lit their torches at just what an appalling film it was, and its disappointing box office suggests that the wave of goodwill he's been riding on for 2 decades might finally be receding. Many people were thankful that his next films would be on Netflix, therefore making sure they wouldn't cluster up multiplexes, but he even managed to annoy people doing that, as Western spoof The Ridiculous Six was beset by news of the movie's Native American cast members were storming off the set, offended at their stereotypical depiction. I know, shocking in a Sandler movie. That included this video of an argument from the set where a producer adamantly defends the creative integrity of a character named Beaver Breath. Incidentally, a good argument for why I don't have Netflix is I don't want to help fund Adam Sandler movies, and for their customers it's the most annoying celebrity and tech partnership since Apple and U2. And finally, most baffling UK celebrity adverts. It appears that when it comes to actors doing bizarre ads for big paychecks, the UK is quickly overtaking Japan, as fronted by Kevin Bacon doing his 6 Degrees game for phone company EE, while yabbering on about local things he clearly doesn't know in the slightest. While Jeff Goldblum's Christmas ads for electronic store Currys were actually sort of inspired, others were decidedly less so. In April, Sylvester Stallone was hawking bread of all things for Warburtons, in which he pitched a Rocky parody about delivering loaves featuring enough dough puns to give you a yeast infection. Not to be outdone, his rival Arnold Schwarzenegger fronted ads for insurance comparison site Compare the Market and their 2-for-1 cinema promotion by being terrorized in his car by those pesky meerkats that wanted tickets to see Terminator Genisys and were presumably quite disappointed by it. Although I suspect Arnold was just relieved not to find a mistress in the back. He was soon replaced in the same campaign by Nicole Kidman as a new girlfriend for Sergey, which rather awkwardly implied she might be in for the possibility of bestiality. Yeah, let's just move on. And with that, let's take a look at my picks for year's absolute worst. And I've seen so many bad movies this year that even Paul Blart Mall Cop 2 didn't make it on here. So here it is, in alphabetical order, the absolute dregs of 2015. Mercenary, Absolution. What does a Steven Seagal movie look like in 2015? About the same as it did 10 years ago, like a bad photocopy of the same movie he's been doing since 1989. The only difference is that Vladimir Putin's best mate is less noticeably doubled, but you'll wish he was, because the absurdly wigged and goateed action star mumbles his lines to the point where they're barely audible, although it doesn't really matter because it's a lot of hard man posing that seems ad-libbed. This looks like a film that was cobbled together out of whatever bits of Seagal they could use. There are large segments where he takes a backseat to either the same flashback played out 3 times, or being shown up by the far more lively Byron Mann as his partner, who gets the lion's share of the fight scenes but still has to be bailed out by Mr. Ego. The plot is some nonsense about rescuing a woman from a torture ring led by Vinnie Jones, who Seagal exclusively refers to as bitch, and the laughable final showdown is a curb stomp battle where Jones doesn't even land a single hit on Seagal, to the point where he even begs for mercy. Don't we all? The Bad Education Movie. It wouldn't be my end of year worst of list if it didn't have another big screen version of a UK TV show, this time the Jack Whitehall school comedy that's so desperate to recapture the success of the In-Betweeners movies it isn't even funny, figuratively and literally. It says something when the film opens with Whitehall desecrating the Anne Frank Museum in a sequence that has nothing to do with the rest of the film, except remind you how they could have set the whole film in Amsterdam rather than Cornwall. Whitehall's irresponsible teacher is so stupid he just great, shepherding his teens from one crass set piece to another, including ancient foreskin, an encounter with Jeremy Irvine's Riot Club, and armouring Ian Glenn's Cornish Liberation terrorists with dildos. An overextended TV episode that has no business being on the big screen is the kind of film where they need to use Whitehall's prosthetic ballsack twice, teabagging either the camera or a swan, because it's probably the most expensive thing in the film. It may not be as atrocious as Keith Lemon the film or Mrs. Brown's Boys the movie, but that's like saying food poisoning is preferable to a flesh-eating bacteria. Both are not particularly pleasant. Blunt Force Trauma. This movie about the secret underworld of dueling has exactly one gimmick. Two opponents stand in a circle wearing bulletproof vests that they shoot at until one is knocked out of it. One of these gunslingers is Ryan Quantum of True Blood fame, who has gradually come to the realization that slowly pulping your internal organs is a stupid way to live in this pretentious indie flick. He tags along with Frida Pinto as an unconvincing bad girl out for revenge, until it turns out that once again she's playing another completely irrelevant piece of window dressing in a career entirely made up of such parts. Glacially paced because writer-director Ken Sansler is aiming for an existential profundity that his story doesn't even begin to earn with its narrative dead zones, there's hardly any plot besides the pair going from gunfight to gunfight until Quantum eventually reaches the sports inventor Mickey Rourke, who finally shows up 10 minutes from the end to mumble incoherent nonsense and fiddle around with his bird, and then close the film off with an idiotic ending that begs for a cry of symbolism! The Cobbler. Thought Pixels was the worst Adam Sandler film released in 2015? Think again. It's amazing to think that Thomas McCarthy, who directed Spotlight, also directed and co-wrote in the same year what is one of the most ill-conceived comedies ever put on film. After a very low-key opening 20 minutes, the moment the film begins to get into its premise of body swapping with shoes, everything goes horrendously wrong. This isn't in any way magical, it's deeply creepy and cynical stuff, including badly judged moments of both comedy and drama, often with unsettling sexual connotations, especially when he becomes his father Dustin Hoffman to go on one last date with his mother. What's even more frankly astonishing is the retrograde attitudes it has, with racist depictions of black people as something to be scared of, although they're great for committing petty crime using their identities, and transphobic humour that's some of the most offensive I've ever seen, with Sandler's character showing little if any regard for the lives of the people he assumes while going on these sprees. Sandler himself spends long stretches off screen, replaced by other actors who show up his lack of energy, which is really saying something when one of those is Method Man, but he's still there for some shocking violence and a final twist into the frankly outrageous. Fantastic Four. Treated with months of skepticism because this reboot ensured Fox would continue to hold onto the rights to the characters, this ironically dark and gritty take on the Fantastic Four makes the Tim Story films look like the MCU. Even though Josh Trank's vision is noticeably diluted in the final film, the agonisingly slow first half suggests that many of his ideas, including a Cronenbergian body horror vibe, didn't fit the material to begin with. And this is a superhero film where they don't even get their powers until halfway through. After that point, it turns into a disaster as the scissors come out, the obvious reshoots take over, and turns into heroes doing training exercises in a nondescript military base like we don't know who these characters are or how their powers work. The sort of cast playing the leads look as miserable and bored as we are, since none of the four are given any kind of characterization, let alone chemistry or a team dynamic, because it takes roughly 80 minutes for all of them to even be in the same shot together. Feeling like the first act of an origin story stretched out to 90 minutes is possibly the most underwhelming superhero flick ever released, and given said company includes Elektra, that's almost an impressive rate of failure. Kill your friends. When a film opens with an unconscious James Corden getting pissed on, you know you're in for a long ride. In this very poor man's American Psycho, adapted by John Niven from his own novel, Nicholas Hoult is a debauched record executive in the 90s who eliminates his rivals to a promotion while his condescending and ubiquitous narration sneers at everything in his eyesight and offers such non-insights as the music industry exists to make money and is filled with drugs. Big shocks there. An egregiously miscast Hoult pisses away his Mad Max goodwill with such a vile pig that even the other characters in the film can't stand him, and yet we're somehow meant to find him charismatic and funny as opposed to skin-peelingly unpleasant. This is one of those black comedies that manages to be both incredibly nasty and spiteful, with edgy, bad taste jokes about swimming through a river of AIDS, paedophiles, and becoming mentally and physically disabled, and rather predictable, where even the montages of drug-filled excesses feels like par for the course. What's worse is the film aligns itself with the character's misogyny, dividing women between objects of fucking or revulsion, and seems to want its despicable anti-hero to succeed. It's like wading through a sewer of hate. The Nutcracker Suite. Apparently that wretched 3D movie with rat Nazis wasn't a bad enough adaptation of poor Tchaikovsky's The Nutcracker, so now we've got this awful animated film that goes even further by basically being the festive equivalent to Food Fight, right down to the inexplicable presence of Ed Asner as a talking owl clock that narrates the movie. The animation and textures are worse than most video games these days, featuring supremely ugly and scary looking character models and long hair that looks like chunks of pasta. Then there's the unappealing voice cast cashing easy checks, including Alicia Silverstone as a little girl and Drake Bell as a Nutcracker, that don't so much inspire whimsy and joy so much as hopelessness and despair. As usual with any attempt to translate this tale to the screen, it basically gives up adapting by the time we venture into Homer Simpson's land of chocolate in the second half for a giant castle siege modelled on the Lord of the Rings. This looks like something that was made in 2000, hidden underground for 15 years, especially with the inexplicable number of bullet time slow motion sequences that still act as if The Matrix had just come out. And nothing says miserly in a Christmas film aimed at children when a good tenth of the running time is just the end credits. Raiders of the Lost Shark. Before I show you anything from this film, I want to show you this beautiful hand-drawn poster in a Drew Struzan style that features bikini-clad women on jet skis outrunning a giant shark. Take a good long look, because this and the title are the only inspired things about this absolute drag. In fact, there's only one thing accurate about this poster, and that's that there's a lot of very cold and uncomfortable women in bra and panties walking into an absolute shithole of a beach in Canada before a poorly CGI'd shark eats them over and over again for an hour, while the remaining 15 minutes is padded out with credit sequences. Looking like someone's home movie because even porn has better production values, this amateurish flick doesn't even succeed at being a Spielberg spoof like the title promises, bar a boat captain that might be a parody of Quint from Jaws if you squint like you've got an eye infection. Mostly it's a lot of appallingly acted, likely improvised comedy in the loosest sense of the word, including a pointless pair of bumbling local cops who have apparently wandered in from the last house on the left. There's a lot of cheap, crappy shark films on the direct-to-video market, but this is so egregiously bad it makes Sharknado look like an Oscar winner. Toxin, aka The Enforcer. We've long known that Danny Glover is too old for this shit, but it turns out he will literally appear in any old piece of it these days. Inexplicably retitled The Enforcer in the UK to fool people into thinking it's about Vinnie Jones knocking people's heads in, he plays Glover's henchman, this pile of nonsense involves Glover's scientist weaponizing an airborne toxin out of mold spores he found in some hoarder grandmother's house, and then re-release it into said house, I don't know, to test it I guess? Logic is not this film's strong suit, as her grandson brings his friends along to help clear out and end up getting infected, with the first half playing like a slasher flick if the killer was a virus, although frankly these idiots do such a good job of accidentally killing themselves that this spring cleaning was probably going to end up as a bloodbath anyway. Featuring some of the most bogus science this side of a 50s B-movie and a character who shrugs off a close-range shot to the gut, it says something that the dismal special effects are the most laughable things here, with the spores represented by bright yellow dots or flat 2D sprites that have come out of the original Doom video game. Avoid like the plague, basically. Wild horses. Robert Duvall is an acting legend, but this Texan drama that he wrote, produced, directed and stars in is a staggeringly tedious bore. Duvall plays a bigoted homophobic ranch owner whose dirty secrets begin to emerge when his gay son James Franco returns home after 15 years, and the police reopen the cold case into the disappearance of Franco's lover, but the story offers no reason to care about what happens to this absolute arsehole of a main character, or even what opinion it takes of him. At some points he's a villain, while others he becomes an almost tragic figure. The Texas Ranger investigating him is played by Duvall's real-life wife, Luciana, whose only other feature credit was with Duvall in Assassination Tango, in a plotline that goes absolutely nowhere and is purely to give a part to his spouse. Josh Hartnett turns up as one of Duvall's other sons, a prominent character who could literally be completely discarded with no effect on the plot whatsoever. At times it seems like Duvall might be trying and failing to examine prejudice, but mostly it just meanders along for 90 minutes with seemingly no purpose or point, and even Duvall's performance is stumbling and listless, with the acting in general being very stilted. This incoherent mess is the purest example of a waste of time as you can get. And with those piles of cinematic extra out of the way, let's turn our attention to some of the best films of the year, and here are my picks of some movies to catch up on if you manage to miss them. Amy. The director of Senna delivers another powerful documentary, this time shining the life of Amy Winehouse. The decision is wisely made to let Amy speak for herself, putting the emphasis on a number of unseen and candid pieces of footage of the singer, especially from before she was famous, while interviewees narrate almost entirely off screen. The result is an incredibly hard to watch and upsetting depiction of how fame can destroy a person who is clearly not ready for it, showing Winehouse as a deeply troubled person who is exploited by the male figures in her life, including an absentee father that she constantly sought the approval of and stifled her recovery several times, and a boyfriend she was infatuated with while introducing her to hard drugs. It's a story that we know the outcome of, but that doesn't make it any less heartbreaking to slowly witness, especially since Amy rather prophetically predicts her own demise, and the film highlights her often autobiographical lyrics. It's a film that leaves you feeling angry at those that failed her, the interventions that were undone, and the people that ridiculed her desperation, but it's something that needs to be seen at least once because it will stick with you for a long time. Bridge of Spies. Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg re-team once again for a pleasingly Capra-esque drama that continues to prove that Hanks is the closest thing we have these days to Jimmy Stewart or Gregory Peck, as lawyer James P. Donovan, who was first assigned the task of representing a Soviet spy played by quietly superb Mark Rylance, and later the task of travelling to Berlin in order to negotiate a trade for the captured spy in exchange for U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers, which is endangered by his determination to free a detained American student as well. It's Hanks on noble everyman form, the purest embodiment of American values, and Spielberg's direction manages to make this true story thrilling and engaging despite the fact that it is the power of negotiation that takes centre stage, not action, although it is in large part because the Cold War stakes are so high despite the fact it is being calmly discussed by men in offices. It feels like a classic old school espionage thriller, and the script, co-written by the Coen brothers, is filled with wry humour throughout, including a subtle running gag involving Hanks arriving into Germany carrying a cold. It's a human and surprisingly optimistic look at a politically unsettled time that, despite the fear and suspicion, also finds compassion and diplomacy to be powerful weapons in diffusing an especially precarious situation. Creed. The Rocky series continues to show the spirit of a fighter in this engrossing spin-off focusing on Apollo Creed's son Adonis, played by Michael B. Jordan. Once again returning to the gritty roots of the franchise, it even manages to incorporate the campy excesses of Rocky IV and not feel out of place. In the title role and re-teamed with his Fruitvale Station director Ryan Coogler, the ever-charismatic Jordan is finally given the starring role that he deserves, as the young star who is determined to prove that he's worth his family name and being loved, and filled with an anger and pain that drives him towards the ring. He finds a surrogate father figure in Sylvester Stallone's Rocky, who thinks he has nothing left to fight for when almost everyone in his life has either died or abandoned him, including his guilt over Apollo and his struggles with illness. We've never seen the character, or Stallone for that matter, this vulnerable, and it's a powerful performance that reminds us how good of an actor he can be. It's a key example of how the film expands and enriches the franchise's mythology, offering respectful callbacks callbacks to the previous films, but also taking its conventions and putting a fresh spin on them, including the fact that Adonis comes from a privileged background in LA that he chooses to shun, or the update of Bill Conti's theme that still rouses. Coogler, in only his second film, helms with extreme confidence, not least in the boxing sequences that are closer and more intense than ever before, including an outstanding sequence where the bout is shown in one continuous shot. It may be the 7th film, but Creed flies high. Ex Machina. Alex Garland's superb sci-fi thriller is an unsettling look at how technology is shaped in our own image for our own needs, purposes and desires, and how that objectification becomes troubling when artificial intelligence and the matters of gender and identity become involved. It's essentially a three-hander between Domhnall Gleeson, Oscar Isaac and Alicia Vikander, and while the film deals with the Turing test that ponders whether a machine can pass for human, it is very much trying to play games with the audience as well and how we process what happens. We're never quite sure what is going on and who is really in control of the situation, with that dynamic always constantly shifting between the three, at times even deliberately leading our sympathies, and there's an intentionally queasy sexuality going on to this love triangle, where the woman is a robot and the humans are fleshy, nerdy and lustful, and that goes into some disturbing directions. Garland's direction and writing is razor sharp, and there is never a wasted moment, with some truly gorgeous visuals in a world that doesn't seem very far removed from where we are now, but dares to ask and explore those complex and uneasy questions when we potentially become the creators of life. Inside Out. Easily one of the year's biggest delights, it's a wonderful reminder of just how terrific Pixar can be after a string of underwhelming flicks. As usual, the animation is nothing short of breathtaking, but it also does that thing that great family movies can do, and that many of the studio's films have achieved in the past, which is resonate with both its younger and older audiences. There's a bright, colourful adventure going on in a young girl's mind that kids will empathise with, but for adults it's a poignant reminder of both how simple and daunting the world seems when you're a child, but also how complicated and turbulent our emotions can really be in a way that's understandable for all. The premise is an inspired one that lends itself to a number of comic and dramatic possibilities, and the solutions Pixar presents are imaginative and funny, with a number of hysterical running gags and scenes of crosstalk. The voice cast, led by Amy Poehler's positive but overbearing joy, are pitch perfect all the way through, with Lewis Black's anger being a particular scene stealer. Although the premise could lead to some dark places if you think about it too hard, the reason for its success is because of its innocence and compassion, and that is a valuable lesson to learn. It Follows. A skin-tingling and highly original horror flick in a period that's cluttered with jump scares and found footage, It Follows is a lot more psychological in its frights and leaves a longer impact because of it. The idea may be somewhat goofy, a paranormal STD if you will, but director David Robert Mitchell gets the right sense of uneasiness, where the entity following Michael Monroe could be anyone, and it is always slowly in pursuit with the inevitability of a zombie. Monroe is a star in the making, especially right after her work in The Guest, and she's got a resiliency but also a girl next door appeal that makes her a likeable screen queen. Mitchell also perfectly captures the disillusionment of being a teenager in a deliberately non-specific time period, with the sense that something strange is happening in suburbia, almost as if the story itself could be passed down like an urban legend, exploring a number of different anxieties. It's a fairly subtle film that prefers not to telegraph its scares, which make the moments where you can see the danger approaching that much more intense, and the unsettling electronic score from Disaster Piece is absolutely terrific, furthering the retro feel with a sound that invokes the work of John Carpenter, and this is something that deserves to be in the same company as Halloween. Although it has divided some horror fans because of its ambiguous indie vibe, if you want something that will make you keep checking over your shoulder, look no further. Kingsman: The Secret Service. If you like the tongue-in-cheek tone of the Roger Moore era James Bond films, then you'll love Kingsman, which is a big old love letter to the excesses of the British spy film with an ultra-violent rebellious streak. Director Matthew Vaughn returns to similar territory as Kick-Ass, but much better this time out, likely because his and Jane Goldman's script largely discards the Mark Millar graphic novel it's based on. It's great to see national icon Colin Firth wearing a pair of spectacles that are super skilled and lethal secret agent, and the moment where his manners drop and his killer instincts take over in a church is one of the year's most virtuoso sequences. Newcomer Taron Egerton as his trainee from the streets manages to give a convincing street-smart attitude and a winning likability to a character who could have easily grated, and the actor is a fantastic discovery who more than holds his own with veterans like Michael Caine and a lisping Samuel L. Jackson. In a time when escapist blockbusters are trying to be darker and more realistic, Kingsman recalls the days of gadgets, secret layers and villains with lethal accessories and revels in being big, surprising and fun. Mad Max Fury Road. As soon as you hear that engine roaring in the opening seconds, the chase begins. An adrenaline-pumping ride, director George Miller returns to the Mad Max franchise after 30 years and gives it a shot of nitrous oxide. Everything is pumped up and amplified, and the post-apocalyptic landscape is now even more insane, primal and visceral than ever before. But also John Seale's cinematography makes it appear oddly beautiful, with luscious and bright fantastical colours scorching the retinas in almost every frame, and setting apart from decades of dusty imitations. As the title character, Tom Hardy plays a man reduced to a single instinct of survival and doesn't so much communicate as growl, which fits the movie's minimalist aesthetic when it comes to the story, a refit of the Road Warrior, allowing Charlize Theron to take centre stage as the one-armed Furiosa, and she and her fellow escapees set out to prove they are more than just things. It's one of the year's most pure cinematic spectacles, with some amazing action scenes that mixes practical stunt work with CGI, and this is a wild ride that is lightning fast but never incoherent but always breathtaking, making sure audiences are always on the edge of their seats. Oh, and there's a flamethrowing guitarist tied to a truck on a bungee cord. What's not to love? The Martian. Matt Damon's only gone and got himself lost again. This sci-fi adventure manages to work on two different levels. The first relies on just how much we like Damon, since the first half is almost a one-man show, and while the film's Golden Globe win for Best Comedy is hysterical in of itself, there are moments in this movie that are genuinely funny, as he essentially vlogs his days building a potato farm made out of his own poo to hold off his own boredom and isolation. The second half of the film focused on NASA's attempts to rescue him on Earth, featuring an all-star cast of terrific actors like Chiwetel Ejiofor, Sean Bean, Jeff Daniels and Jessica Chastain. Is equally engaging and suspenseful watching these highly intelligent characters try and figure out a way to solve their problem against the meagre resources and equipment they have, in a manner that's very reminiscent of Apollo 13, except, you know, this rescue is fictional. At its heart is a pulpy adventure story, but smartly told with a touch of scientific accuracy, but still accessible, with Drew Goddard's adaptation of the novel doing a solid job of translating it to the screen, and this is easily the best film that Ridley Scott has made in over a decade. Star Wars: The Force Awakens. After the disappointment of the prequels, the Star Wars franchise makes a hugely successful comeback at the hands of J.J. Abrams, deliberately showing its allegiance to the original films with a storyline that intentionally calls back to A New Hope, at times a little too closely. The Force Awakens both reintroduces us back into this world, while also expanding it and laying the groundwork for more exciting possibilities to come. Although the original stars are mostly here to give their blessing, with the possible exception of Harrison Ford, who enjoyably steps back into Han Solo's shoes in a key role, the new cast are very impressive, with Daisy Ridley and John Boyega being hugely engaging leads, and the fact that a major series has a woman and a black actor as its main characters feels almost revolutionary. The supporting cast, including Adam Driver as the conflicted and selfish but possibly redeemable Kylo Ren, a slightly underused Oscar Isaac and his Ex Machina co-star Donald Gleason doing a Peter Cushing impression are also great to see. The biggest positive for this latest version of the series is they'll make long-term fans feel like they're right back to 30 years ago, managing to feel at once very familiar and fresh at the same time, as you try not to squeal in delight at the Millennium Falcon blasting into hyperdrive once more. So there you have it, the best and worst of 2015, and Bad Movie Beatdown will be back soon with some more terrible movies, alongside the latest 2016 releases on projector. But until then, I'm Matthew Buck, beating down bad movies everywhere.